Hello everyone, and welcome to the first lesson of this online class. What I will be doing in these lessons is going over the primary contextual ideas surrounding the course readings that I've assigned for you. So by this I mean that I'll be examining the historical, the literary, the philosophical context according to which the text that you'll be reading, such as Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther and Descartes' The Meditations on First Philosophy, such that these texts will make sense to you, that you'll understand, okay, where the authors are coming from. So it's very important to have a contextual basis for understanding, especially historical authors, because otherwise we always tend to interpret things from the background and the knowledge and the understanding that we do have. That comes from what? From post-millennium life as we've known it now. So a lot of these authors, such as Descartes and Goethe, they've grown up in the 17th and 18th century. They lived during times which were quite different from our own. So understanding, the types of things that were going on during those times will help us to better interpret what it is that they're doing. And so this is going to be a very important element that I'm going to emphasize throughout this course, is the nature of interpretation. Indeed, in many ways, when we look at this first question, what is humanities, we'll see that, well, interpretation is going to have a lot to do with what it is that the humanities, the human sciences, which we'll talk about what that is, what they're doing methodologically, what they're doing in practice, such things as philosophy and history and literature, religion, etc. So it's going to differ from such things as the natural sciences, such as physics and mathematics, right? And so interpretation is going to be a very important point in this course. And one of the most important things to recognize from the start is that you're already interpreting. You've grown up within a certain background. You've grown up whether in Missouri or in Kansas or in New York. You're a certain age. You have certain experiences, certain education. You've learned a specific language. You're in a specific culture. You've read certain books. You have certain religion. So what that means is that you're interpreting the world before you even start to think about, okay, such questions as, well, what is the world and what is life and what is existence, etc. Questions which the humanities explore. Now this is important because then when we look at something like a historical text, or we look at texts that arise from other traditions such as ancient Greek culture, or from a French tradition, or from an Asian tradition such as a Japanese tradition, we're going to see that these people have a certain way in which they're looking at the world, which, although similar to our own, well, of course, they're human, so it's going to be similar, will naturally also be different. They're going to be interpreting the world differently. So when you read their texts, when you begin to learn about other cultures and traditions and books, you want to be aware of your own context so that you're not actually interpreting what you're seeing in others wrongly. So, and to do that, to avoid that, you have to be aware of yourself, aware of the ways in which you understand the world, and you also have to be aware of the context from which these individuals wrote their works or produced their works of art, etc. Okay? And so that's why I'm going to be looking at some of the historical, the literary, and the philosophical contexts from which these people interpret the world. Now, what we'll be doing in this first lesson is looking at the question, well, what is humanities in the first place, right? This is just kind of a general humanities class. And I think that one of the things that I think a lot of you may come into this class thinking is, well, humanities 205, American Revolution to the present, okay, it's something like a great books class. We're kind of trying to learn about Western traditions, read a lot of good books, and educate ourselves. Well, that's true. That's true. There's a basic sense in which that is true. But the idea of that, where that came from, comes from a long tradition where interest in the complete education of the human being takes a central position. So the humanities, as I teach it, is not just about, well, learning and reading and trying to educate ourselves. It's about trying to produce within ourselves a better human being, a human being that better interprets the world, that evaluates, that judges and doesn't judge too quick as well, okay? That understands others and understands different contexts, okay? So when we're looking at humanities in this class and we're reading the texts that I've chosen, these texts have been chosen with a purpose, okay? One of the main central ideas of the class is that we're going to start looking at the question, well, what is the meaning of life? You know, why are we here? What's our purpose? Okay, what is love? What is this mortal life that we're living? You know, is there an afterlife, or is this just it? You know, these are central questions to all the humanistic traditions. Okay, so with that much said, let's get started on the first slide here. So we have just this general question, and we have a little picture here of Da Vinci, from Da Vinci's drawing, Leonardo da Vinci's. And we say, what is humanities? Okay, the humanities, okay, this is just a general term, are a group of academic disciplines, as I say, like art, history, philosophy, that all explore something about the human experience, the human creative spirit, okay? Now think about that for a second, okay? What does it mean to experience, right? Well, experience is something that is taking place right now. You are watching this video, right? And I'm right now, as I record it, I'm recording the video, okay? As you watch, as I record, there's also things going on around you. I'm not sure what's going on around you. Specifically around me, there's the air conditioner in the background because it's very hot. It's the summer. There's different things happening outside. There's the movements of my body, okay? All of these things are taking place within my experience, okay? And I'm experiencing the world, notice how it's happening, in time. So events are flowing. They're flowing as I experience them. And I'm also, of course, interpreting these events. So I say, oh, that sound in the background, that's an air conditioner. Oh, this noise outside, that must be a truck. You see how the sounds become certain signs or symbols by which we interpret our world. So when you look at the different humanistic disciplines such as history or philosophy or art, you see that in order to get at this human experience, well, historians and artists and philosophers will do it different ways, okay? Now the creative spirit, of course, is about human production. So it's about the way in which we relate to our world, yes, talk about our world and think about our world, but also the way we produce things, okay? So this is especially relevant within the arts. We have sculpture and we have painting, there's architecture, okay? But even when you look at something like history, okay, you think, well, what is history doing? Is history just kind of reporting events? Not really. In a way, history is kind of looking at the events of the past in which people experienced these things, wrote about them, and then, well, handed them down to the next generation. And now a historian has to look at this report from another person and say, what was this person thinking when they wrote this? You see, what really happened? Yes, that's important, but how did they experience as well? Certainly the artists, when they make a picture, we have a portrait here, we have the example of Da Vinci. What was he thinking when he made this drawing? Certainly he's thinking of the human being in some sense, but I'm sure he's thinking of a lot more than just can be related by the picture itself. And part of humanities is the attempt to understand that, okay? Now, of course, this general depiction doesn't really tell us much about what the humanities are. And the reason it's very important to understand this is because today, in our modern world, a lot of what we call knowledge has been taken over by the name of science, okay, science. And so when you think about knowledge, when you think about science, right, well, what do you generally think of? I think when I think of it initially, I'll think of something like physics, biology, chemistry, the hard sciences, right? Mathematics, etc. Well, the thing is that that term science, however, has a history that goes way beyond these modern sciences. So let's take a look at this. So we have the question, what is science, right? Now, as I said, today the term science is employed as a slang word. Okay, so in other words, the term science has meanings or connotations that extend beyond the way in which we tend to use it today, such as natural science, physics, biology, etc. And when we use the word science, we tend to mean it just in an everyday sense of natural science, but there are more extensions of the term. There are more senses that extend beyond it. Why? Because we can talk about something such as mathematics. Mathematics is certainly not a natural science in the way physics is, right? So that if we say that all science is natural science, though, then it will exclude mathematics, which is very strange, because in many ways mathematics seems to be the mother science, right? Okay, so let's see how we can get around this problem. So, historically speaking, the word science comes from the Latin word scientia, okay? And that comes from the ancient Greek word, which means of episteme, okay? At least it's a translation of the ancient Greek word episteme. So that the original notion of science meant simply knowledge, and knowledge in a very general sense, okay? For example, if I asked you, what's the color of your cell phone or your car, okay, you could give an answer to that. You might say red or blue or black, right? And there's a certain type of knowledge there. Now, notice how that notion of knowledge is not quite the same as the notion of knowledge that we use when we talk about something like physics, okay? The notion of knowledge there is something much more refined, okay? And that notion can be applied in many different contexts. For example, when we talk about history, we can talk about knowledge as well. When we talk about philosophy, we talk about knowledge. And certainly their knowledge is also not the same as that type of knowledge that we find, for example, in the natural sciences. So when I speak of science in this class, I'm going to use it in the broader, more historical sense out of which the term arose, especially among the ancient Greeks and even the Romans, okay? And that notion of science, as it's written here on the PowerPoint, is any systematic body of knowledge, okay? A system of knowledge, right? That expresses something, at least possibly true, about the world, okay? And why do I say possibly true? Well, because we can talk about things that don't necessarily exist, but could exist, okay? For example, we could talk about possible worlds, okay, that are possibly out there, maybe in existence where, let's say, Albert Einstein didn't exist, okay, or an existence where our president was someone different, okay? So we can talk about that systematically. We can obtain a certain knowledge in doing so, right? So that's why I say possibly. So let's then divide the types of sciences, okay? And in doing so, we'll obtain 3 specific types. Okay? So now the first type I've written down here is that of a formal science. And by formal science, I mean logic and mathematics. So let's think about that for a second. When we do mathematics, right, are we talking about the concrete world? In other words, are we talking about plants and trees and cars and mountains? Yes and not yet. Not yes. Okay, so yes and no, rather. The reason is that mathematics deals with a level of abstraction. Okay? Abstraction means to draw away from. So mathematics deals with abstraction where you're drawing away from the concrete thing and talking more about something which is, let's say, more intellectual, and that's why I use the word here, formal. So, for example, if we have a bunch of cars in the street, well, mathematics isn't really interested in the cars themselves, but mathematics could be interested in the number of cars. It could say, well, there's 4 cars, and if we add another 3, we would have 7, right? Notice how the notion of 4, even though it can be related to the cars in the street, it's very different. It's not tied to the cars because it could be 4 ducks or 4 trees or 4 apples, you see? So mathematics abides within a realm which is somehow next to the physical world, which is why something like physics and the hard sciences can use mathematics to explain the world. But at the same time, mathematics is apart from the world. It stands apart, which is why we call it a formal science. And logic itself is very similar as well, where logic is the apparatus of reasoning that we use when we talk about the world. For example, here's an example of logical reasoning. If it rains outside, then we won't go to the beach, okay? And so what happens is that it rains outside, and so you can conclude, therefore, we won't go to the beach, okay? See, this is reasoning. Now notice how reasoning can be set into various different forms, like numbers as well. You could have 4 cars, 4 trees. Our reasons can be different as well. So, for example, I can say, if it snows outside, then we'll go sleigh riding. It snows outside, we go sleigh riding. So we have the same interesting abstraction within logic that we had in mathematics, but whereas mathematics deals with something quantifiable, numbers, geometrical shapes, patterns, right? Logic deals with human reasoning, but they're both abstract in an interesting sense, an intellectual sense, okay, which I've explained, which is why we call them formal. In fact, in recent times, it's been shown that mathematics is in many ways reducible to logic, which I won't get into here. So the next type of science is an empirical science, okay? So we're going to have to qualify this, characterize or discuss this a bit more, but empirical science, the word empirical means experience, and in particular sense experience, okay? I include within the empirical sciences the natural and social sciences, because today a lot of the social sciences like sociology, okay, even psychology, they tend to apply techniques and methods such as observation and experimentation that are employed in the standard natural sciences. Now, what characterizes a natural or empirical science, rather, is this emphasis upon experience. We're going to observe the world, we're going to test the world, and we're going to form hypotheses about the world that we can see and touch. All right? So I think that's pretty straightforward. Most of you understand the notion of what an empirical natural science is. So the last one then, last type, is the human sciences, or you can also call them the critical sciences. I'll just make use of the term human sciences here since, well, the class is called Humanities, so it just makes it easier. And the human sciences such as history, philosophy, art, etc. So they're going to be different from the formal and the empirical sciences. Why is that? Well, the formal sciences, they deal with these very abstract entities, right? The empirical sciences, they deal with the world that we see and touch. The human sciences, well, in a way, they can deal with both types of things and yet other types of things, okay? Let's take the example of religion. Within religion, we can talk about God and angels and spirits, right? Now notice how, well, the notion of God is something intellectual. God is not something physical, so you can't study God in the natural sciences. But God is not formal, like, for example, the number 2 or the idea of a square, because God is supposed to be something more of an individual entity, being, okay? So because of that, only the human sciences really have the possibility to study and to ask the question, well, what is God, okay? And so something like theology would study the issue of God, or something like philosophy would ask the question, does God exist? Something similar happens when we talk about the nature of art. So if we look at a work of art, for example, the works of Michelangelo, the works of Raphael, the works of the great painters, well, we can ask the question, take a painting, it's something physical, right? Yet at the same time, when we talk about the aesthetic value of that work, we see, well, it's not quite physical. There's something intellectual there too, right? And for sure, scientists sometimes try to explain the beauty in art in terms of science, but every time they do so, they fail miserably. Because there's just something about beauty in art, or the work of art, okay, even sometimes the ugly in art, see? It's still art in that sense, that extends beyond the confines, the capabilities of our senses. Somehow we encounter art, and it's tied to this notion of something like the human creative spirit, okay, whatever that is, okay, which is a big issue. So these are the three types, and the formal, and the empirical, and the human. Now, when we talk about a science, we've distinguished types of sciences. We can also talk about what the science studies, which is its subject matter, and how it studies it. Okay, so I haven't actually written that down there. Okay, you might want to put that down in your notes. So subject matter is about what the science is studying. Methodology is about how the science goes about studying the things that it studies. Now, the reason that I'm making this distinction is because if we distinguish the three types of sciences based upon subject matter alone, then we're going to find that the distinction is not good enough. Why is that? Well, in some ways we can talk about, for example, let's say philosophy. And philosophy can study something like consciousness. And a philosopher can ask, what is consciousness? What does it mean to be aware of oneself, right? At the same time, a neurologist or a psychologist or a cognitive scientist can also ask the question, what is consciousness? Okay, what does it mean to be aware? And of course, philosophers and cognitive scientists, they're going to be asking the same question, so it seems like now that philosophers and cognitive scientists are doing the same thing. But we've already distinguished the two and said, well, cognitive science would probably belong more to natural science, the social and natural sciences, and philosophy certainly belongs to human sciences. What this points to is the need for a deeper distinction. And one way of doing that is to look at methodology and to say, well, cognitive scientists and philosophers, they're certainly studying the same thing, they're studying the same subject matter, in this case consciousness. The difference is that they're studying it in different ways, okay? And so maybe one clue to this might be to say, well, whereas a cognitive scientist asks what is consciousness and seeks to answer the question by saying, well, consciousness is something which is caused by this physical process in the body, okay, so a type of reductionism or naturalism, which is proper to the natural sciences. A philosopher will ask the question, what is consciousness in terms of its nature? In other words, what does it mean to be conscious in and of itself? So we could possibly answer that question by saying, well, consciousness somehow implies this being in relation to a world. Okay, a world presents itself, you see? So, of course, the differences are subtle, but as you get into these different disciplines like philosophy and the natural sciences, you start to see that actually these differences are methodologically real and distinct. Okay, so we have then this distinction. So the subject matter then, just to go over this quickly, is something like what the sciences study, the objects a science studies based upon where the science starts. Okay, its starting point or genus. Okay, just to give an example there, for the genus, think about biology. Biology begins with the genus, this is just a general term, of living things. History, for example, begins with a different genus. You could say maybe historical events or actions. Okay? Theology begins with a different genus or starting point. You could say with God. Philosophy begins with another one. For example, you could say maybe reality or being itself. Okay? So all of the sciences have different starting points in terms of subject matter, sometimes they can run into each other, which is why we have to start looking at methodology, because the starting point can affect the methodology you apply, right? So, again, for the subject matter, we can look at something like the formal sciences, and we see within logic, well, what is the subject matter of logic? Reasoning, okay? As I said before, all human beings are mortal. Socrates is a human being, therefore Socrates is mortal, you see? That's reasoning. Now, what logic would do would study that formal structure of the reasoning, would kind of remove Socrates, mortal and human being, and just say, well, what was that process there where we came to that conclusion? Mathematics, on the other hand, studies something like quantitative patterns, okay? Something like the Pythagorean theorem and the various properties of lines and squares and the properties of algebraic equations, etc., okay? The empirical sciences, okay, they will study specific things designated by their genus. So physics, for example, will study matter and energy. Biology will study living things. Chemistry will study molecular processes, okay, and so on, okay? And the human sciences, again, will have their own subject matter. History, historical processes, philosophy will study being. Art will study the work of art, the historical work of art, and aesthetics, and so on, okay? Now, in order to better understand methodology, okay, we can approach the issue by looking at the nature of a hypothesis, right? So here I define a hypothesis as a statement or assertion that says something about the way things are, okay? So, and as a note, we often state hypotheses without knowing whether they are true or false, which is why we call it a hypothesis. So if you know the truth and falsity of the statement, then it really doesn't make sense to assert hypothesis, okay? Although you can. So, for example, you can say, well, you know, maybe it's in the 12th century and you've never traveled around the world and you don't have any maps except for a map of, for example, Europe. You could say, I think that the Earth is round, and I think if we start, let's say, in Italy and move west, that we can eventually keep going, and find ourselves back at our starting point, okay? In fact, individuals in the past would actually had and postulated, hypothesized that the Earth was round. For example, Christopher Columbus, when he sailed west and discovered America. Okay? He decided, well, the Earth is round, and some said, no, it's flat, and as you sail off into the great sea, you're going to fall off of the Earth. And as it turns out, they were wrong. Notice how that hypothesis there can be shown to be true or false by actual experience, physical experience. You actually have to sail around the world or go in space and take a look. You see, well, look, the Earth is round. So here's another hypothesis. There is a greatest possible number. Okay, this would be a hypothesis for which science? Mathematics, right? And in this case, we're saying that, if we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, on and on and on and on, we're going to reach a number which is the greatest possible number which we cannot count any higher from. Okay? That's another hypothesis. It happens to be wrong, false, okay? But it's a hypothesis that you would have to prove in order to show it's wrong. Okay? And the next hypothesis we have would be God exists. Now, this would be a hypothesis. Usually, you'd say that this would be a hypothesis or within philosophy, okay? Because, of course, in theology, you can also start with that statement, and usually in theology, the statement would just be asserted as true. So theologists would not necessarily begin with the question, does God exist? Because in theology, the existence of God is taken as a matter of faith. In philosophy, however, philosophers do not start with such an assertion. They rather ask, does God exist? So in philosophy, philosophers will often try to produce proofs in order to respond to the hypothesis itself. All right? Now, the aim of every science, and it doesn't matter what science we're talking about, whether it's history or philosophy, physics or mathematics, okay? The aim of every science will be to formulate hypotheses, and these hypotheses will be formulated about the subject matter that they deal with, whether it's God or the earth or the greatest possible number, and then try to find ways to show whether these hypotheses are true or false. Now notice how based upon this aim, this will dictate the method. Why? Because you can't use the same method to show that the earth is round, that there's a greatest possible number, and that God exists. And thus we have all the different sciences which will be fundamentally distinguished by the objects they study and the way they study it, right? So, let's start with the formal sciences, okay, and talk about what the formal sciences do in order to show that their hypothesis is true or false. Now, in the formal sciences, such as mathematics and logic, they make use of what's called a deductive hypothesis, okay? A deductive hypothesis is a hypothesis that can be proved through deduction, which is a type of reasoning, okay? Normally we think of deduction and we just call it a proof or a demonstration. I'm going to give an example here below. So let's take that hypothesis, there's the greatest possible number, and let's see if we can give a proof of it to show that it's true or false. And so here's the proof. We start. Let n be the greatest possible number, just some possible number n, right? We say n is the greatest possible number. If I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I get to this number which I'll call n, and I'll call that the greatest possible number. Since n is a number, right? It's a greatest possible number, but it's still a number. Then as a number, it must obey all the rules of numbers. So since n is a number, just like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, n must obey all the rules and properties which 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 obey if it's going to be a number. So that means then we can add and subtract from n. So let's add. In doing so, we get a new number, m, which would be, for example, n plus 1 is m, right? But wait a minute. If we can add to n, which is the greatest possible number, and get another number m which is greater than n, then this must mean that n is not the greatest possible number, okay? And as it turns out, any number that you hypothetically suggest as the greatest possible number will fall into the same problem. That you get some other number, let's call it x. And you could say, well, what about x plus 1? Okay, so then x isn't the greatest. What about y then is the greatest? Well, y plus 1. So there's no greatest possible number. Now see that? We've proven that this hypothesis is false, and we've done it through reasoning alone. Okay? That's the methodology of the formal sciences. Now let's turn to the methodology of the natural sciences, and I have part of the periodic table here. Now the natural sciences, it's a bit controversial. There's a lot of discussion among philosophers and scientists as to what constitutes a proof or demonstration in the natural sciences. But in general, the consensus is that, well, the natural sciences make use of something along the lines of what's called falsifiable hypotheses. Okay? A falsifiable hypothesis is a hypothesis that can be empirically tested, that should be tested by observation and experiment. Okay? For example, here's a hypothesis. Within a vacuum, two objects of differing mass or weight, m and n, will fall at the same speed. So let's take the example. I have two objects in my hand, one's heavier than the other. Okay, they're both the same size. I put them in a vacuum, right? One's heavier, and I drop them. And I say, I think they're going to fall at the same time, and as it turns out, they do. Now notice that in order to show this, I had to actually do the experiment, right? But notice also that it's not really the experiment which is confirming my hypothesis. Why? Because maybe tomorrow it's possible that the heavier block or mass will fall faster. So you see? So what I would have to do then tomorrow is do the experiment again in order to show that, well, my hypothesis still stands. That's why scientists today say, well, what we're not trying to do is confirm hypotheses, but falsify. So, and this makes it a little harder, you see, because now what you have to say is, in order to show that my hypothesis is false, I would have to actually go out there and figure out a case in which the heavier ball falls faster. And only if I show it, then will I have falsified it. Until then, my hypothesis is good, which is why these laws of gravity hold up even today, because nobody's been able to show otherwise. They haven't been able to falsify that hypothesis that we have there, okay? And this is the methodology of the natural sciences. Now, of course, as you get into something like social science, like psychology and sociology, it gets a little more difficult to do these things. So you might have to rely more on something like a confirmatory hypothesis. And in some cases, a lot of these sciences, the social sciences, often veer into the humanistic sciences, such as political science. The reason for this is that, well, when you start talking about something like political science, which is indeed a social science, and does indeed use empirical methods, you also have to get caught up with such things as, well, justice and the question of justice, what's right and wrong, what makes a law right and wrong, and you see those questions now start to lead you into something like philosophy, which is more of a humanistic science, all right? So let's then get into the humanistic sciences. So now, the actual fact is that in the human sciences, most of the human sciences are not really clear about what it is that they're doing methodologically. So what I've done here is I said, look, certainly the human sciences aren't using deductive proofs like in the formal sciences. They try many times in the human sciences, but they fail miserably. And certainly they're not really using falsifiable hypotheses as the empirical sciences and the natural sciences, because then they would just be empirical sciences. So just to rule out all other options, we'll say that they're just using non-falsifiable hypotheses. They're using hypotheses and asserting hypotheses and then trying to find ways to show these hypotheses are true or false. Okay? Now, a non-falsifiable hypothesis is a hypothesis that cannot be empirically tested by observation and experiment. And for an example, we have the hypothesis that God exists. Okay? Now, we could try to give a proof of that hypothesis, and indeed, when we look at Descartes in the next lesson, we'll see that he actually attempts to give proofs for the existence of God. And you'll have to ask yourself, is that proof viable? Do I believe in God because of that proof, or not believe in God? Is that going to convince me of anything? Okay, so that's a question you'll have to ask yourself, and it leads into deeper questions in terms of, well, what are the human sciences doing? Certainly there are people out there who believe in God or do not believe in God, and they have reasons for this, right? Are these reasons the same types of reasons that you have when you look at something like a mathematical statement and then prove it? I don't think so. And they're certainly not the same reasons that you have in believing in gravity, because, well, we're sitting on the chair here, and gravity's holding me down, and I can feel it and see it. But God is not something you can see, but people believe in God. Okay? So there's other reasons, and the human sciences deal with that. Okay? And so in this class, in many ways, we'll be dealing with these other reasons and trying to figure out, well, what is it that the human sciences are doing? So, what do the human sciences do? Okay? And what I'm going to do is give the answer in terms of a narrative. Okay? When you tell a story, for example, you tell a narrative. Now, the human sciences attempt to demonstrate non-falsifiable hypotheses through a variety of methods, right? Argument, explanation, description, interpretation, and so on. But the primary aim is to give a compelling narrative, for example, a story or account about the human experience, okay? And in doing so, the human sciences try to kind of account for all the facts. Now, this might all sound very grand. let me give you a specific example in order to show you that this is not far out there, that this is actually very important, this notion of a narrative in terms of everyday life. If let's imagine, for example, that suddenly, out of the blue, you're accused of a crime and you find yourself in court. Now we're going to see this later when we talk about Camus, the stranger. Okay, we're going to see that the individual Morceau is going to be convicted of a crime. Okay, it's going to be different contexts, but we'll be talking about that later. Anyhow, you find yourself in court, and let's say in this case you're quite innocent. In fact, let's say you were sleeping through the night, and so whatever it is that the crime is about, you had nothing to do with it. And as you're sitting there in the defense, the prosecution begins to weave a tale, a narrative, right, about the events that occurred. Okay? And as you're listening, now you're certain that you were sleeping, you start to think, wow, this is pretty convincing. It seems like I did commit the crime. And yet you're certain, because of your own experience, that you weren't there. Now, so notice this is a kind of a radical case, which does happen, though, unfortunately. But it shows you that within law, the prosecution and the defense, in order to prove, right, that the individual who's on defense did it or not, right, they weave a narrative based upon the facts of the events. And that narrative can be very compelling and convincing, so that a very good lawyer can even push a narrative which is false. Okay? Now this shows us that we have to be very careful with our narratives, because we have to not be deceived by narratives which are maybe compelling in the sense in which they appeal to certain popular opinions, okay, or views, and so we're convinced of the narrative based upon something like the beauty of the speech of the speaker, okay, but rather we should be convinced by the truth of the account, how far the account, the narrative, appeals to the actual events themselves. And that's what the jurors have to do. Now, in the human sciences, okay, all of us are the jurors, right? And in a way, we're also the prosecution and the defense. And we need to weave the tales about events, whether it's history, about the existence of God, and we need to stick to the facts as much as we can. Now, the facts within the human sciences extend more beyond just the pale of our empirical experience of the world, because we can talk about history, we can talk about fiction, we can talk about art, and we can talk about our own experiences. And I have a few other examples here. We have a historian, for instance, will tell a story about the ways things were using historical documents, artifacts, and testimonials. So in a way, the historian is the lawyer of the past, right? And they try to present a case for what happened in the past. And is there truth in history? And you see, yes, the answer, there has to be truth, okay, in history. There has to be truth in the human sciences. Because if there isn't, then in the courtroom, we're convicting people or letting people go without any basis in truth. And so if that were the case, there's no justice. Now, perhaps the world is that way, but it seems to me that we're better off thinking that the world is otherwise, that there is truth, and that facts can be presented truly in a case so that the right person is convicted or let free, you see? And the same thing will happen in history, and theology, religion, and philosophy. A case can be presented for the existence of God, which can be compelling, or which can be true, or which can be false, right? And just as in a courtroom, we're the ones who have to judge. Now here's some techniques, methodological techniques, that are often applied within the humanities. Just as a side note, the natural sciences, empirical sciences often make use of these techniques as well. So do the formal sciences. For example, argumentation is used in mathematics. I'm using this here because when we start to look at our literary projects that I've assigned you throughout the class, a lot of these literary projects will have you specifically applying some of these techniques. So take a look at this right now. And if you need to, as we go through the class, you can come back to this slide here and just review it. So analysis. Analysis means you take something which is complex and you break it down into something simple. Okay, I give an example here, which is maybe a bit too abstract. The best example would be a literary work of fiction. For example, we're going to be reading Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther. That's a novel. Now, you can break down a novel into its parts. You could say, well, here's the beginning, here's the end, here's the middle. You could watch a movie, right? And you could say, there's the main part of the movie. It has a plot. You can subdivide the plot into different parts, and you can talk about what actually happened in the different parts. You see, that's an analysis. So in analysis, you're not trying to discover meaning that's not there. That would be interpretation, which I'll talk about in a moment. Rather, you're just trying to analyze the main parts of a work or fiction or even a work of art, right, or something historical, and just identify those parts. In doing so, it will help you to understand and to better form your interpretation. Now, interpretation, then, is what I call the disclosure of meaning. So going back to the example of a narrative or a film, you can break down the film into all its parts, its subplots, etc., and then you can try to tie them all together and ask the question, what was this book trying to say? What was this film trying to say? So you could think about a film that was very odd and was very difficult to understand. By using analysis, okay, and then trying to interpret, you try to disclose the meaning of the film or the work, okay, or the book. Notice also, again, you always have to be aware of those prejudgments that you have in your mind about the world. Because you can approach, for example, a book or a film, and from the beginning you could say, well, I don't like it, but you don't really know anything about it. That means you're prejudging it. So when it comes to interpretation, you want to be aware of those prejudgments, and to the extent that's possible, you want to kind of put those on the side and try to examine the text objectively, okay, to the extent that's possible, because your subjective interpretation will always come into play. Next, we have argumentation, and I gave the example of argumentation, a few examples when we talked about mathematics and logic. For example, if it rains, we go outside. It rains, we go outside. There's an argument. Okay? Explanation. So explanation is giving the account of something by showing its cause. So, for example, when we talk about later on the two world wars that occurred in the 20th century, you could say, well, what caused the First World War? And the answer is the assassination. It's one of the minor cause, the kind of a fixed cause. The assassination of the Prussian Archduke was a cause. See that? Now you're giving an explanation. In many ways, the natural sciences attempt to give explanations for events in the world as well. So a narration, we've seen already, is a story that weaves events, facts, experiences into a whole. Notice how narration and interpretation would be tied together, because when you interpret something, you kind of narrate, right? A description is a little different. It's when you kind of just describe what a thing is like. Okay, you can say, well, describe your car to me, or describe the new dress that you see, that you found for the wedding, what it looks like, you see? Criticism, okay, is not the type of criticism you think when someone's saying something bad about you, okay? Criticism is a particular method in the humanities in which you evaluate literature, art, and society based upon the cultural context from which it arises. So we can take a certain painting, right, from a modern painter, such as the British painter Banksy, the street artist, and say, well, what makes that art, Banksy? You're painting things on the walls of buildings, right, outside. What makes that art? Once you start asking that question from that perspective, now you're offering a critical evaluation of the artwork. Okay? So again, as we get into these literary projects, we're going to explore some of these methods a bit, and you're going to apply these techniques within writing within this course. All right? So we come to our last slide now, and I just want to give you a general overview of the main divisions of the human sciences. Okay? We have first, of course, history, and history in general studies historical artifacts or events or the way people understood the world, and in general attempts to understand and interpret the past. Okay? On the other hand, there's linguistics, or the human language, the human discourse in history. And linguistics studies languages, semantics, social discourse, the right formation of words. Also linguistics, we can include in that the study of the classics, such as ancient and Greek literature, German literature, Old English literature, etc. Okay? And we would include within this something like the academic discipline of English. And then there's art and art criticism. And art criticism studies the nature of art, the work of art, the theory of art, evaluates art, etc. So we can include in that, of course, art history, the fine arts, sculpture, art media, various medias, film, okay, architecture to some extent as well can be included in that. We have then religion, which studies religious beliefs and institutional structures. So we have something like the Islamic religion, the Christian religion, the Judaic religion, something like Buddhism, Taoism, etc. Okay? And their structures throughout history, that would be part of religion. And philosophy is always a very difficult question to ask and to answer. I, by training, am a philosopher. And of course, this course will be from a philosophical perspective. But we can say that philosophy studies just the fundamental or the general questions that center around our human existence. For example, what is it to exist, right? Who am I? Why am I? What brought us into this world? Okay, what's truth? What's knowledge, right? What is goodness? Okay, what's right and wrong? These are all philosophical questions. So, hopefully you've gotten a general understanding at this point of what humanities is. Now notice, of course, I'm giving it to you from the perspective that I think, which is more of a philosophical perspective, but personally I think it's also the more correct perspective, because otherwise we're just looking at great books, and really the judgment there's no basis for saying, well, what makes a book better than another? Really nothing, except for the fact that it's been popular. So we're not looking at things that way. We're looking at humanities from the perspective of the ultimate and fundamental questions which we've asked, okay? And from that perspective, we can start to study works of art and literary books, okay, and even films, etc., and from that perspective, and start to get an understanding, well, of our past and of how people have interpreted the world, and that will help us to better interpret our own